Bismillah wa salatu wa salam ala Rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back to the Lockdown Library with me, Asim Qureshi. I've got another book today, single one. I'm going to be discussing Doubt in Islamic Law, a history of legal maxims, interpretation, and Islamic criminal law by Professor Intisar Arab. One of the books that I think really developed much of my own thinking about a subject matter I knew very little about. There's a central maxim, a central ethic that sits at the heart of this book, which is her discussion around the legal principle: avoid imposing criminal sanctions in cases of doubt. So the whole book, and she covers a wide range of scholarly discourse, from all the madahib within the Sunni tradition to also the Shi'i tradition as well. It's a very, very scholarly piece of work. It's quite academic in many ways, but what I'm hoping to do with this episode today is to really just discuss some of the central elements of the book that I found very useful. And I guess the reason I picked it up is because the whole notion of Islamic criminal justice was something that was a bit alien to me in terms of its complexity. Yes, I've read various and studied various texts of fiqh over the years, but like the deeper meanings that are attached to the notions of ethics within the Islamic criminal justice system was something that had evaded me. And so somebody I think had recommended this book, and so I picked it up. But it is quite expensive, unfortunately. So perhaps if you know somebody who has a copy, you could borrow it, or maybe there might be a cheaper paperback version at this time. But I bought the hardback when it first came out. So what does Professor Rab say herself about her central contention in her book? What she says, my fundamental claim is that medieval Muslim jurists claiming to be textualists deployed to doubt alongside other extra-textual legal maxims to form a pragmatic method of interpretation that increased their institutional power over law. To accomplish this interpretive task, they articulated ideals of moral values, legal processes, and interpretive authority by which they sought to define the legitimate use of force in Islamic criminal law. What she's effectively saying is that the ulama from classical times, what they were doing is that they were looking at the law itself and saying, okay, this is the strict letter of the law, but how do we understand our interaction with this law based around all the other ethics from the Quran and the Sunnah that we are given, in terms of being able to interpret how this law should be applied. And in that regard, this doubt canon, what she calls the doubt canon, this principle of doubt that is being discussed at the center of this book, becomes very, very central to the way in which the ulama were able to exercise control and power even over the law itself by making it more human. So, there is, of course, this constant struggle between authorities that exist. So we have the authority of the state, the power of the state, whether it was kind of khalifa structures in the past or even kind of nation statehood ones today. But the ulama, they've always supposed to play a role, which is to exercise a sense of autonomy away from that, as a way of checking and balancing the power of the state itself. And it's interesting that, Professor Rab, she says herself, the jurists asserted that they, rather than the political rulers, possess both the religious, moral authority and the institutional competence to determine when avoidance rather than enforcement was appropriate under Islamic law. So she's talking about where people should be punished, that the ulama had always asserted that they were the ones who had the right and the authority to understand when somebody should be punished and when they should actually have mercy applied to them. goes on to say, they established a judicial practice of invoking the doubt canon in this process, a principle that gained virtually unassailable authority once they could cite it as a foundational text. So the ulama together, they developed this idea of doubt, that punishment cannot take place where there is existence of doubt that casts any doubt about whether or not the action fulfilled the legal criteria for punishment. I think that's the key here, really, that we're not talking about people being just let off for the sake of being let off. The question here, really at the center of the book, and what she largely deals with, is around capital punishment, and even corporal punishment. But the central issue here is the capital punishment itself. So where there is the prospect of death on the other side, what the ulama were effectively doing by developing this doubt doctrine was saying that, look, the punishment on the other side of this offense is so severe that we need to know that we've got this right in order for there to be any prospect of us going further with the punishment. And what's so fascinating, especially in the early period, is how little to actually non-existent the punishments actually are. She's not shying away from the Sharia the way that it was practiced in the classical period. She cites the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam when he says that even if his own daughter Fatima was to have stolen, then he would have applied a punishment to her. But what she's explaining is that these criminal laws in particular, the vast majority of them, were intended to promote adherence to Islamic moral ideals, rather than necessarily being a prescription for severe punishment. It's about, in her mind, and what she's presenting to us in quite a compelling way, is that the severity of the punishment is about letting society know that there is a very strict moral code. It's not about the punishment itself, it's about what the punishment might mean for society. And she, in that regard, she quotes the second Caliph of Islam, Umar ibn al-Khattab, who is reported to have said that, when he was acting in his own capacity as a judge, he mentioned, if you come to me with a criminal dispute, I would question to the utmost extent possible, for I would rather make a mistake in pardoning than make a mistake in punishing. That's very, very telling, actually. And it comes back to this kind of phrase that you'll find even within the Western tradition, that it's better to let 10 guilty people go free than allow one innocent person to be punished. And I think there's something in that, in terms of the ethic, not only of the Quran, but of the life of the Prophet ﷺ himself, that it seemed that he was interested in analyzing and investigating every single aspect of a criminal act in order to make sure, and indeed I would go further, say in order to try his hardest to not apply a criminal sanction as much as possible. And I think that's, from an ethic of the Prophet ﷺ, that's really fascinating. She takes on other cases as well, Professor Rab, throughout the book. Like, for example, she talks about rape and the way that sometimes rape is understood within, say, for example, the laws around zina. But of course, what she clarifies, and rightfully so, is that they're not supposed to be covered by the same legislation. Rape is a criminal act that exists outside of any notion of zina. It's not something that can be dealt with in the same way. And again, she cites Umar ibn al-Khattab, who says that that if a woman claims that this has happened to her, then rather than it being seen as evidence of some kind of sin, she should be fed, she should be clothed, and then the Muslims should be instructed to act kindly towards her. Again, such a Umar al-Khattab, he's often got this reputation of being this forceful enforcer of kind of Islam's most kind of strict measures, but people often forget to cite the aspects of justice that that was so central to his character, that he was interested in understanding the depth of what it meant on the other side of a punishment. He didn't want to just go around applying punishment to people. He wanted to understand what justice looked like and in those circumstances. So I think, what the book gave me, at least anyway, is that Islam's notions of justice are extremely deep and nuanced. Of course, non-Muslims have this view that the Sharia is just about kind of chopping off appendages and harming people. But really, when you go through the history of Islam, it's so much more deep than that. It's so much more fascinating and interesting than the way that it's presented. And what we forget sometimes is that a lot of this is political, that some of the way that we practice is extremely political, and the way that the ulama sometimes engage with the law can become political too. Probably for me the most fascinating part of the book was when Professor Rubb starts talking about what she terms the elite leniency maxim. So she actually presents that there came a stage where certain ulama were trying their hardest to suggest that those who are in elite positions of society, that somehow there should be a leniency that is given to them that isn't given to others. But alhamdulillah, like what she also shows, that scholarship withstood, the vast majority of the scholars, they withstood the desire to develop this maxim into something that became real, that became widely practiced, rather that they pushed back against it and said that no, we can't allow for those in authority to simply get away with crimes just because, or to be lenient towards them just because they're in elite positions within society. So what we learn is that the implementation of Islamic criminal law cannot be understood outside of the political environment, especially in the contemporary world that we live in today. And especially when the Prophet ﷺ himself and the Khulafa Rashidin, they were the best examples of its implementation, or indeed lack thereof, in many circumstances. So, perhaps I'll end. It's quite a lengthy paragraph, but with give the final word to Professor Rubb herself, who really does a great job of contextualizing why this book is so important within contemporary times. Of course, the vast majority of the book is about how this topic, how this doctrine of doubt was developed within the Islamic legal structures throughout the classical period, and how it still has relevance for us today. But she situates the whole book when she says, continuing foreign influence had the unintended effect of creating nostalgia for an imagined golden era when Muslims, sovereign over their own affairs, were able to implement a criminal law regime ostensibly marked by broad enforcement of Islam's criminal punishments. Appeals to such ahistoric notions of this imagined golden era brought symbolic legitimacy to actors in West African countries, to name one example, such as Nigeria and Mali. There, these actors have sought to rhetorically restore the rule of Islamic law by enforcing Islamic criminal law through a modern state apparatus or as non-state actors, respectively. Yet these Islamists are not legal scholars, nor are they historians. They tend to be unfamiliar with Islamic law beyond basic texts, which typically contain singular formulations of the substance but not the extensive procedure of Islamic criminal law, as it developed through the doubt canon. In short, the most vehement advocates for Islamic criminal law exhibit little to no understanding of its historical contours, and certainly not of the contextual definitions, function, and uses of doubt. I think that's a great way to end this episode, because as Professor Rubb explains to us, that much of the problems that we see in the implementation of Islam's justice system really become very, very reductive, and we don't see the complexity and the beauty of how Islam provides us with a much deeper and nuanced way of understanding crime, human behavior, and ultimately dealing with other people with empathy. So Jazakumullah khair. Inshallah, hopefully, I hope that was of some benefit and use. I'll be interested again to know if any of you pick up the book, and I look forward to being with you again next time. Jazakumullah khair. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.